Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar on adult learning and training trends. My name is Ian Borkett. I'm Union Learn's Service Manager and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. I can already see participants are lively this morning and commenting in the chat. That's great to see. Please keep introducing yourselves to each other and keep the chat going throughout the webinar. We also have an Ask Question button at the bottom of the screen. Please feel free to add some more detailed and specific questions for our speakers in here. We will try and get round to answering all the questions towards the end of today's webinar. We have Yusuf running the technical support for today's session, and I'd like to apologise in advance for any possible issues that may occur with either audio or visual. With broadband capacity still being an issue with so many working from home, these things can happen, and we can assure you we will try and sort them out as quickly as they occur. Right, well, that's the housekeeping done for today's webinar. Now I would like to introduce today's session, and today Union Learn is delighted to be joined by two distinguished adult learning experts. On today's Union Learn webinar, we will hear from Dr. Fiona Aldridge, Director for Policy and Research at the Learning and Work Institute, and Ian Murray, Union Learn's Strategy Manager. A warm welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us today. Fiona will present findings from the latest edition of the Adult Participation in Learning Survey, which is an annual survey undertaken by the Learning and Work Institute. Fiona will be sharing the latest survey findings, highlighting some of the key trends and focusing on some of the lessons learned during the COVID-19 lockdown. Ian will present findings from the latest edition of the government's employer skills survey and Union Learn's training trends in Britain report. Ian will give his interpretation of the research findings and what this means for reps and union learning. These survey findings provide a fascinating insight into the current direction that learning is taking, along with useful information that points to future skills needs, which will help unions and reps plan for future projects and support. So I think this morning's presentations will really provide some sort of valuable information and insight to ULRs and reps and project workers engaged in adult learning. So without further ado, I'd now like to hand over to Fiona.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me to talk about the survey findings. I'm going to be presenting some of the top line findings, happy to answer further questions later on, but I just want to canter through first of all. So let me... Right, so the Adult Participation and Learning Survey has been happening annually since 1996, and it's a survey of 5,000 adults across the UK, and we're wanting to know whether they have engaged in learning recently or further time ago, what sort of learning, what they're getting out of it, what their motivations, barriers, benefits are. So it's a really well-established survey, and I want to share this year's survey findings with you. Just to start though, this is the definition of learning that we give people. As you can see, it's well beyond the kind of publicly funded provision. It's not just about courses, it's not just about qualifications, it's a really broad definition of learning. And adults are given this definition of learning and asked whether this is something they currently do, something they've done in the last 3 years, something they've done as an adult but more than 3 years ago, or something that they've not done since leaving full-time education. And so as we go through the findings, it's really worth bearing in mind that this is a very broad definition, and it also counts on people's ability to say, yes, this is something that I do. I am an adult learner. And as you can imagine, that for different groups of adults, whether they see themselves as a learner or not, can be very different. But nonetheless, I think it has some very important things to show us and for us to discuss. Now, before I go on to this year's findings, what I want to show you is the findings that we have collected over the last few decades. And what you can see is that these figures are current and recent participation put together. So adults that have engaged in learning in the last 3 years in each survey. And to be fair, the findings are pretty consistent. Every year, around 2 in 5 adults say that they've engaged in learning. You see some peaks and some troughs, but generally it's pretty even. But if you look towards the right-hand side of the screen, what you'll see is that since about 2015, we've seen a year-on-year decline in participation in adult learning. And it's unsurprising, really. Over the last decade, we've seen a significant cut in opportunities for adults to learn. We've seen a 47% cut in adult education spending. We've seen a cut around employer investment in training. And therefore, it's unsurprising, I think, that we've seen this decline. So last year's figures showed that just 1 in 3 adults said that they engaged in some form of learning or training in the past 3 years. And that was the lowest that we'd found in the survey series. And I think going into this year's survey, I was really interested in seeing what the kind of changing context would have done to the figures. Now, these are this year's figures. Just one caveat before I talk about the numbers. The survey historically has been a face-to-face survey done in people's homes. So someone knocks on your door, asks you a set of questions and collects the data. Because of COVID, we've had to change to a telephone survey. And what we don't know is how much of any change is to do with the fact that we're not doing this face-to-face, we're doing it over telephone. So we're not doing direct comparisons. But if you look at the figures, current and recent learning put together, those top 2 figures, 60% of adults say that they've engaged in some form of learning in the last 3 years. So it's significantly higher than previous years. And that could be to do with all sorts of things. I'm interested in your thoughts afterwards as to what that might be. What we still see is that 1 in 5 adults say that they've not done any learning since leaving full-time education. So I think some things to unpick there. But as well as looking at those last 3 years, we wanted to look particularly at what happened during lockdown. And it's partly because we knew that the findings wouldn't be comparable. There's all sorts of disruptive forces, but really interested in the kind of changing circumstances. So if you cast your mind back to March 2020, when the national lockdown was implemented, we had millions of people working from home or were furloughed. We had parents homeschooling their children. Adult learning providers and employers suspended any in-person teaching, and where possible, learning was delivered online. And so we were interested to say, well, what has all of those changes, what impact have they had on learning? And we found that 43% of adults said that they took part in some form of lockdown learning. So that's 2 in 5 over that short time period. Now, when we asked how they'd done that learning, recognising the suspension in in-person teaching and that lots of people weren't in the workplace, and if they were, they were incredibly busy, we asked how that learning had been undertaken. And 90% of lockdown learners said that some of that or all of that had been done online. So 60% completely online, 30% a mixture of online and offline, and just 10% of learners said they were doing that offline. So in a sense, there's some great news because there were lots of people who had either continued online learning or taken it up for the first time. Of course, as you'll be aware, we also have quite a significant digital divide, with some people not having access to technology, to broadband, skills to be able to go online, maybe confidence to do that. And one of the dangers of such a move to online learning, of course, is that there will be some people that have been significantly excluded from opportunities to learn because of the move online. We also we wanted to kind of work out how much of this was online learning that was happening anyway. 44% of these lockdown learners said that actually they had done more learning online as a result of lockdown. And actually, it wasn't all about providers or employers putting their provision online. Actually, 55% of these learners said actually they learned something independently, 24% through apps, websites and social media. So there's quite a lot of kind of self-initiation to be able to take on some of the learning that was available. Now, when we asked people why they were learning, a third, the biggest group, said that they were learning as a professional requirement or for work. And of course, you can imagine that as people had to adjust the ways that they were working or felt a kind of economic uncertainty about their job and future employment, you could see why that would happen. But there were many other reasons why people engaged in learning too. So personal development, personal interest. 1 in 10, as you'll see, said that work and time pressures were reduced for them during lockdown, and so they had an opportunity to learn when they wouldn't have normally. Again, a similar proportion said they really needed something to fill their time during that period. So a whole range of reasons, and I'm sure, as you'll be aware, that people do want to learn for work reasons and have employment and economic benefits, but learning is much broader than that, and often those broader ways are ways of engaging people in the first place. We asked people about the challenges of lockdown learning too, and some of these are related directly to learning and some to the challenges that we've all faced around being in lockdown itself. So people reference things like lack of the time that they had face-to-face with their peers. Others said, actually, it's really hard with work-related time pressures to continue learning. A similar proportion were trying to juggle work and learning with childcare and homeschooling. And again, 1 in 10 saying actually it was really hard to maintain motivation. So a whole range of reasons why, yes, people were engaged in online learning much more than before, but there's some real challenges of that. We do have to think as we hopefully soon come out of another lockdown about what the benefits are of online learning, but also what some of the challenges are and how we might mitigate those. One of the things we looked at, and we look at in all of our surveys, is around inequalities. So who gets to take part in learning? It's great news that we've seen many more adults engaged in learning, but when we look at the patterns, there's some really stark inequalities. As with all of our surveys, what we find is young adults, full-time workers, those in higher social grades, those with better qualifications to start off with, are all more likely to be learning. It's not entirely unexpected because we see it all the time, but it is concerning given what we know about the unequal impact of the pandemic on the labour market. So we know that workers with fewer qualifications, those in lower skilled or lower paid roles, those who have least access to kind of training normally or poorer, fewer years of initial education, those are the people who are going to be most affected, who will most need to retrain or to upskill in order to be prepared for the post-COVID economy, and yet they were least likely to take part in these learning opportunities. In fact, when we looked at full-time employees and compared those who continued at work and those who were furloughed, we found that it was those who continued at work that were more likely to be learning. Now, that probably has something to do with the profile of who was furloughed and who was able to carry on at work. But it is concerning given that those furloughed workers could be most likely to lose their jobs in the future, that there wasn't a stronger focus on helping people to learn and retrain and upskill during that period. As we think about next steps, I guess one of the key points from the survey, and it says it year after year, is that learning begets learning. If you can get adults engaged in learning and support them well, they're more likely to continue. 2 in 3 adults who engaged in online learning during lockdown said that they are likely to continue online learning in the future. A small proportion said actually it's really changed their approach to learning at work after lockdown, and they would be more likely to engage. So that's great news. Our wider survey, when we go back to those 3 years, let me share this chart, it's my favourite one from the survey, and you see it year after year after year. We ask about future intentions to learn as well as current participation. And what we see is that those who are currently learning, 4/5 of those say that they're likely to learn in the future. But if you look at the right hand of your screen, those who say they've not done any learning or training since leaving full-time education, a similar proportion say they're unlikely to. So I think there's lots about saying if we can get people engaged in learning, if we can give them confidence, give them opportunities, give them the right support, then we know that they will or are much more likely to continue learning. So just going back to some broader research, we've been doing quite a lot of qualitative work to think about how do you get adults engaged in learning, and this is where we could come to in the discussion. And there's a tipping point for most adults, I guess for all adults, but it's a different point for each one. People decide to learn at the point where the pros, the benefits outweigh the cons. And so one of the challenges for us, if we want to engage more adults in learning, is taking away some of those barriers. But equally important is helping people see the benefits, how it aligns to their goals and to their interests or to their future prospects. Happy to talk about that more later. And then just finally, and perhaps we can pick up more of this in the discussion, what might we do about it? And I just want to reference a report that we produced recently, thinking about the role of trade unions and social partnership in workforce training. I guess some key starters for discussion for me is that we desperately need a lifelong learning strategy with public investment. And we know that unions have a really important role in that, in creating a lifelong learning culture at work. We need to boost employer investment. And again, there's an important role for unions in collective bargaining in doing that. We need to make sure there's more accessible, affordable and attractive opportunities for lifelong learning and helping people understand how it meets their aspirations and goals. There's certainly something about career reviews, and I know Union Learn and unions are very involved in this, so that we help people make those decisions about their learning. We need to have a relentless focus on those who will otherwise miss out. However much we increase participation, we will always leave people behind unless we have this focus. And I know from the work in this report and our wider work about the role of unions in engaging low-skilled workers and making sure that there's more equal access to training in workplaces. And just going back to the survey findings from this survey, we really need to make sure that we embrace the opportunities that technology provides, as well as thinking about how we address the digital divide. I'll leave it there, but happy to pick up questions later.
Thank you, Fiona, for that fascinating insight into adult learner participation during lockdown. As you mentioned, we will explore further some of the findings you've highlighted when we come to take participants' questions, but certainly given us a lot of food for thought. And particularly some of the issues you mentioned now in your final slide about reversing a decade of decline that I think we certainly picking up in terms of lifelong learning strategy with public investment, work around careers reviews. As you mentioned, a lot of ULF projects, a lot of our unions have been doing a lot of work in terms of delivering career reviews to workers as part of their supporting older workers work. So I'm sure there will be a number of questions and comments from participants. So please, if you do have any colleagues, please put them in the question box and we will pick them up after Ian's presentation. So I'd now like to invite Ian to give his presentation.
Good morning, colleagues. Well, I'll attempt to build on that excellent presentation by Fiona. I'm just going to try and pull my PowerPoint up, so if you just bear with me for a moment. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to focus on the workplace. One caveat: what I'm going to cover this morning won't actually doesn't really include the period since lockdown. It's looking at employer and employee surveys up to around 2019. I'm basically going to cover this. I'm going to look at what employers are saying, largely from the findings from the government employer skills survey. Then I'm going to look at what actually workers say about the training they get from employee surveys and TUC research published last year. And then I'll just finish like Fiona with some sort of general policy points that we can pick up in the discussion. The employer skills survey is the largest kind of survey of its kind in the UK. It's been around for around 20 years now in various formats. Since about 2011, it became a kind of UK-wide survey. For some reason, Scottish employers aren't included in the 2019 one. I assume that was a decision by the Scottish government not to participate. But still a very large survey. Over 81,000 employers were interviewed for the 2019 survey. There's a couple of links there at the bottom around where you can find the full report, and also a blog I did on the actual main findings. What are some of the key findings? The most worrying finding from our perspective was around the number of employers, percentage of employers saying that they just don't offer any training at all to their employees. And that increased between 2017 and 2019 from 34% to 39%. So you've got now 2/5 of employers saying they don't offer any training. What was really concerning about this, the latest statistic is that since about 2005, this ratio has hovered around 34–35%. Why it's increased by 5 percentage points in this 2-year period, we haven't quite sort of bottomed out, but it is kind of a worrying trend. Partly as a result of that, the proportion of employees in the 2019 survey saying they received no training in the past 12 months had increased from about 38% to 40%. So you've got 2/5 of employees saying they don't get any training at all, basically. The researchers do a kind of bit of, they do a bit of number crunching to actually look at sort of the average amount of training employees get. Which was around 4 days per annum in 2017. That's gone down to 3.6 days. If you go back to the 2015 survey, there's even a bigger decline. It declined from 4.2 days to 3.6 days. And then they total up all the training they believe it's going on in the economy, but through what they call total days of training. So basically, they just analyze the amount of training that every employee gets. And looking at these figures, they show that sort of in 2017, they've got about 105 million training days delivered in the UK. But by 2019, that had declined to 99 million, we've lost about 6 million training days. If you go back to 2015, the cumulative decline is around 9 million. So we've seen quite a kind of sharp decline, especially in the latest 2-year period, around the amount of training people are getting at work. The amount employers spend has also declined a bit. We've seen it decline by about 13% over the last 2-year period. So employers, the survey shows employers are also spending less on the training. As well as looking at sort of what employers invest, the amount they invest, there's another couple, well, there's lots of detailed findings in the report, long report, but some of the kind of headline stuff that we've picked up is around sort of what employers' attitudes are, which the researcher used the term training equilibrium, which basically refers to employers who say that they're basically content with their current levels of training. So even though training is going down, employers were saying, an increasing number of employers were saying they're quite content with the training levels they were delivering. Went up from 59% to 61%. I suppose one of the most bizarre findings in the report is that this attitude was highest amongst non-training employers. So 72% of employers who don't provide any training say they're quite content with their current levels of training or non-training. I think the other kind of key area that the survey looks at is skills shortages, and they do this by analysing vacancies, and they come up with a kind of a classification of what they call skills shortage vacancies, which are vacancies that employers find difficult to fill because people who are applying for these vacancies either lack, the relevant skills, qualifications, or experience. And the proportion of vacancies that are still shortage vacancies has been rising quite rapidly and sharply since over the last decade. And I'll show a chart in a moment that sort of that highlights that. By occupation, it's become increasingly evident that sort of where employers are facing the greatest challenges is finding suitable candidates for what they term skilled trades positions. And nearly half of the vacancies for these occupations are classified as skill shortage vacancies, now 48%. Well, just a couple of charts just to highlight some of these findings. This basically shows, well, the top line shows the proportion of vacancies that are skill shortage vacancies. Back in 2011, it was 16%, and it's by 2019, it's increased to 24%. And the volume of skill shortage vacancies has increased from around 85,000 to 214,000. So it's nearly trebled in the last decade. So obviously, employers are having a hard time sort of recruiting people with the right skills and etc. This is a bit of a more detailed chart, but it basically shows, provides a sector breakdown for 2017 and 2019. The dark bars are the latest, the 2019 figures, and it shows that sort of sectors like construction, manufacturing, utilities, are sort of, are having the greatest difficulty sort of recruiting people, because they're reporting the highest proportion of skill shortage vacancies. And that sort of tallies a little bit with sort of the findings around employers finding it hard to sort of recruit skilled trades. And obviously things like Brexit, etc., are going to have a sort of huge impact on this in the years going forward. Okay, that's the employer survey. I'd just now like to turn to the employee surveys and the Training Trends in Britain report that Union Learn published last year. We commissioned an academic called Professor Francis Green to update some earlier research he'd done in training trends since the late 1990s, along with some other sort of well-known academics in this field. He published a piece of research drawing on analysis from the labour force survey, the government's labour force survey, that showed the total volume of workforce training had fallen by around 50% between 1997 and 2011. And this is a kind of report we've sort of highlighted a lot in our research reports, and also, when we actually sort of engage with government around some of the kind of challenges around weak investment in employers' training. We asked Professor Francis Green and one of his colleagues at UCL University, Dr. Golo Hensenke, to actually update the analysis using a number of employee surveys. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but basically what I'm going to focus on today is the labour force survey, because the earlier analysis up to 2011 was done by the labour force survey, and they updated that analysis. I mean, the other key thing with the labour force survey is it's a massive survey. It involves 100,000 people being interviewed quarterly. It's actually the main source of the government's data on sort of employment trends, unemployment trends, etc. So it's probably the biggest employee survey that's around, and it's a government survey. We asked when they actually undertook the analysis of what had been happening in the last decade between 2011 and 18, they found there'd been a further decline of 10% in the total volume of training that employers were providing, which basically means that between 1997 and 2018, there'd been a 60% decline. One bit of good news was we also asked them to do an analysis of sort of union members and their access to training at work and how that compared with non-union members, and that actually showed a continuing sort of benefit of union membership, with 37% of union members said they were accessing training on a fairly regular kind of basis, getting training around every 3 months, and that compared to 22% of non-union members. They also looked at an analysis of who had actually suffered most in the latest decade, and not surprisingly, it sort of tallies with what Fiona was saying earlier. Sort of people with lower level qualifications saw the greatest reduction. They saw a reduction of 20%. And another group that we were a bit more surprised at were that sort of young adults saw a kind of a greater reduction in the amount of training they were getting. And this sort of table basically sort of highlights what was happening to young workers and lower qualified workers. Lower qualified workers there in the bottom row are those who are sort of classified as not having attained either a GCSE or level 2 vocational qualification. The drop in their training was 20%, and basically this table, it was a bit of number crunching we did at TUC to look at the amount of hours they were losing, and the last column shows the average number of hours they were losing. Young workers get a lot more training, and that's sort of evidenced in this table by the higher number of hours they were getting, but they lost about 7.15 hours, which is basically over that period they were losing 1 day of training a year, so it was quite significant. The other analysis that they looked at was about the type of training people were getting, and one of the key things they found here was that sort of off-the-job training, sort of training you either said, away from your desk or away from your factory or whatever, has declined quite a bit, declined from around 58% to around sort of 53%. And if you go back further to, they track this back to 1996, and they show when it was around 73%, nearly 3/4 of people said they were getting off the job training, and that's declined sort of hugely since then. The other kind of key finding was that sort of shorter durations of training were on the increase. So people are getting more short-term training, and that's the orange line on that chart. And basically the same, you see the same trend if you go further back. That's sort of back in 1996, 34% were saying they're getting training of less than a week, and now that's sort of around 55%. The other kind of finding they came up with was that sort of employers were actually delivering on the training they had to for sort of legislative reasons, health and safety, etc. But there was a decline in sort of more sort of long-term kind of vocational training. The full report's available on the TUC website, and you know. A lot more detailed information there. I think we can pick up on some of the detail and questions. I'm just going to flag this report up as well. Fiona did. It's a report that sort of TUC sort of Commission for Learning and Work Institute. I mean, I think if you want to get a really good picture of the latest trends in workforce training, this analysis by Joe Drome in the Learning and Work Institute is excellent, as well as excellently making the case for how the UK and England in particular is so different from many other European countries where sort of most governments work in close partnership with employers and trade unions, and what is called a social partnership kind of arrangement around workforce training. We just don't have that in this country, and of course we've seen the latest evidence of that is that sort of the government's decision to actually terminate the grant for the Union Learning Fund in England from next March. How can we deal with all of this? Well, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I think it's probably just to raise some of these points as well. You know, there are some recommendations that we anticipate government will deliver on from the Auger Review and Commission for the College of the Future around sort of boosting investment in the FE sector and the college sector, including giving a bit more priority to the needs of the workforce as well. But we think it's not enough, and I think one of the main challenges that has come out of the research from the Employer Skills Survey and the Labour Force Survey is that people in the workplace, workers, really don't have many entitlements, and this is very different to many other European countries. The impact of COVID has obviously sort of, transformed the challenges facing us. They were bad enough before COVID, but now we're seeing sort of challenges on a whole different scale. So some of the things the TUC's been calling for, there's a new right to retrain, funded by starting the National Skills Fund sooner rather than later. The development of lifelong learning accounts. A lot of countries are using that as means of actually sort of empowering people to take up learning. Midlife skills, career reviews, union learning reps are doing a lot of work on there. We're saying that should be an entitlement and should be aligned with a new right to paid time off to give workers a greater empowerment in the workplace. Long-term funding for the Union Learning Fund, well, I think that's even funding for next year will be welcome at this stage, to be honest, really. And we've also been calling for a new national social partnership approach, covering adult skills and apprenticeships with a call for the National Skills Task Force. So I'll stop there.
Fabulous. Thanks, Fiona and Ian. That was great and a very interesting insight into learning trends and what this might mean for our future union learning and skills work. I'd now like to explore some of the themes and trends you mentioned in your presentations by taking a few questions that we have from participants. So if we just look at some of the questions that we have. The first question, I think this is one for you, Fiona. Yeah, do you have a breakdown on gender that are taking up courses? I find that there are more females taking up courses.
Yeah, so in our survey, across the board, there's roughly the same proportion of men and women engaging in learning, but they do so in quite different ways. So men tend to be much more, I suppose, go towards independent and online learning. Women, I think, more towards kind of social learning with other people, and therefore you might see more women on courses, and certainly if you think about the publicly funded offer, there are far more women in that sort of provision than men. It has changed over time, particularly as more women are in the labour force, because such a lot of this is dependent on what sort of jobs people have, who they work for, and the training investment by those employers, which comes back to the kind of second presentation and who gets access there. So it's about equal at a top level, but we certainly need to do more on all sorts of things to make sure that people who we don't think are there get opportunities to learn. And that might be about roles, previous qualifications, gender, age, all sorts of things.
Fabulous. Thanks for that, Fiona. I think yeah, a couple more questions on the adult participation survey. One about, do we know the duration of those learning opportunities being taken up by learners during lockdown? Is it bite size or a mix? And also a question about, do you have a breakdown of learners that are either office based or shop floor based?
So in our survey, we don't have that breakdown, and we don't know how long it is. We just ask people if they're engaged in learning. What we are doing, however, is on the back of the survey, we're doing a number of qualitative deep dives. So we're going into people's experience of online learning, and that should help us to find out a smaller number, but kind of more rich information about people's experience and how long the provision was and what it involved and how much support and a whole range of things. So by the end of the calendar year, we hope to be able to publish sort of maybe three other reports, which gives us some more detail about that experience and what it involved.
Okay, I think it's an interesting question about sort of bite-sized learning. We've certainly find that that's a really good way of getting people re-engaged with learning, particularly if they've sort of got low confidence, and it's a sort of great first step back into it.
Absolutely. I mean, if you haven't done learning for a while, or not at all since an adult, if the last thing you did was, a set of GCSEs or A levels or their equivalent, and don't feel that you did very well at those, then why would your first step be a big full qualification? And I think what we see is that the best way to engage someone is find something that they would like to do and help them to do that. And actually, SURE is quite helpful because it just gives people a sense to find themselves as a learner, to be confident about it. And then you need to think about where's the support and the progression routes to help them continue with their journey. But it would be great to see far more short, sharp pieces of learning that people can engage with, and a really broad curriculum that aligns with people's interests and motivations.
Yeah, I mean, just take this opportunity to give a plug. We've actually just launched and released some new bite-sized pieces of learning on the Union Learn website as part of our skills and recovery work. So there's some nice little bite-sized pieces of learning about online interviews, developing your own sort of online CV and job profiles, and lots of sort of other sort of useful information about sort of online job searches, etc. So I would definitely recommend colleagues, if you haven't seen those, to visit the Union Learn website and the skills and recovery page to look at those. There was also a question regarding the sort of coverage of the data. Somebody's asked, are these stats and data UK wide, or are they just for England?
So on our survey, it's UK wide. We can then break that down into each of the 4 nations, and in England into the regions. But Ian will have to answer the questions for his data sets.
Yes, as I flagged up, the one for the employer skills surveys, the latest one's a bit odd because the Scottish government, I assume, decided not to participate. So it covers England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and some of the comparative figures with 2017 and earlier. They've rebased the figures, so they're comparing like with like. The labour force surveys, it's UK wide. And it's, because it's basically used as a kind of a UK-wide source of employment and employment trends, etc.
Great, thanks for that clarification. That's also really, really helpful. Another a question we've had from colleagues around productivity. So Ian, I'll ask you to sort of comment on this one first. Is there evidence we can point to around productivity and training? One way to convince more employers to provide training is to make the case that it will improve productivity at the company level.
Yeah, there's certainly sort of research that definitely makes that link. And I think some governments waking up to it a bit more, now, and in particular, in anticipation of things like the impact of Brexit on top of what's happening with sort of the impact of COVID-19. So that there are sort of detailed research findings. I think what's proved more difficult is making that point to individual employers quite often. And one of the challenges that economists have sort of highlighted in the UK is that we do have a long tail of what's called low skills equilibrium employers, where they're making a profit out of what they're producing, whether they're manufacturing or there's a service or whatever. So the incentive for them to upskill and uptrain their workers is, it seems it's less, because they're still making a profit and making money out of it. So some of the arguments we've been putting forward is you need to actually maybe sort of rebalance the scales a bit. And how do you, by incentivizing and empowering individual employees to actually have greater leverage with employers around accessing training.
Fiona, is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I think in our work around individuals, what we see is that there's this weighing up of things, isn't it? How much does it cost and what will I get out of it? And exactly the same is true of employers. And so, yes, training can be a cost. I think we have to do more to demonstrate that training is an investment with business benefits. And I think it is, however much research you provide, it's very hard to convince individual actors that this applies to them. And I think this is where unions have a real potential to make a difference that the rest of us can't, because of their location within the business, and being able to demonstrate that for every change that happens within a business, every attempt to grow and to develop, to adjust working practices, that skills plays a really key role. And sometimes I think that's about hard facts and figures, and sometimes it's about those conversations and those stories that help people understand something. And so this is why, when we did the paper for Union Learn, that we very much wanted to demonstrate that it is about that there's this really strong connection between where there are unions and union learning reps, and where there is an impact on who gets training and the difference that it makes. And it's not always in the hard figures, but it's very clear that there's a major difference between unionised workplaces and those that aren't. And we need to tell that story more, I think.
Yeah. Absolutely, Fiona, and I'd echo those comments, and also I would certainly sort of urge colleagues, if you haven't seen a copy or read it yet, to have a look at the new LWI report, the Levelling Up report that was published the other week. It really does make a compelling case about the difference unions make to increasing learning opportunities for workers and life chances, and it does really make a very strong case about having a union presence, increasing that learning, how that does help employers increase productivity, ensuring that there's a fairer distribution of learning opportunities, and that we can lever in more employer investment as a result of collective bargaining. So there really is some really strong data and results in that report that we can use to really press the case with employers on that. So I'd certainly urge people to have a look at that report. There's some really useful data and statistics in there about those issues. Just a sort of a couple of other questions I'd like to make or ask, and Ian, I'll put this to you first. Ian, you mentioned at the end of your presentation that TUC's one of the things TUC's calling for are lifelong learning accounts. How can lifelong learning accounts help increase adult participation? How do you see this working?
Well, I think the key thing is trying to give people ownership of their kind of Access to funding. I think it's all right to talk about a level 3 entitlement, but it doesn't really ring, it doesn't really resonate well. A lot of people out there, they haven't, especially people who haven't done any sort of learning or training since they left school. And I think that's one of the points we've been making to the government around how union learning reps and bite-sized learning is actually really important to actually get people on the pathway, because you don't get people just even on the pathway to learning. There's no way they're going to go off to the local college and say, I want to take up my level 3 entitlement. It's just not, it just isn't real life for many people. The idea of life, we've had individual learning accounts that collapsed in the past due to fraud, etc. But I mean, lifelong learning accounts, there's quite a lot of evidence in other countries, and the OECD published quite a kind of a really good report last year that actually looked at how lifelong learning accounts will operate in many other countries, including countries like Scotland and Wales, where they are still they still do function. But other countries have even got more ambitious programs. And it actually means that people feel like they have a handle on how they could actually access learning and training, whether they have a kind of personal bank account or not. But it actually means and I think the other important point that the OECD report highlighted was it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to cure everything. And actually, a lot of the research shows that many of the countries using lifelong learning accounts are actually also using it in tandem with many other kind of policy issues. And some of them are around sort of giving people a right to time off to learn, and other ones are around actually sort of establishing an entitlement to skills and career reviews. These things are happening in other countries, so we're not asking, and also in tandem with sort of what unions are doing. So it's a mix, but it would be. We believe, and many other stakeholders, I think, believe it would be a good starting point to actually incentivize people.
And Fiona, I know sort of LWI have done quite a lot of work looking at lifelong learning or personal learning accounts. Anything else you'd like to add in?
I think just two things, but very much agree with Ian. I think that we need to give people, we need to create that sense that learning is something that everyone does and therefore you can do. And that when you give people some budget and say, this is yours, you can spend it. If you don't spend it, it's a bit of a waste. I think you're more likely to have people think, well, what can I do with money that is mine if I can use it? I think it creates just a very different dynamic. I think the other thing is that we need some money in those accounts so that people can purchase things, but we really need them linked to information, advice and guidance, because I think what we see from all of our research is that many adults it's not that they've thought about training and dismissed it. They haven't even really thought about where they want to go and the role that learning could play in helping them, and whether it even would, and whether it would open up opportunities, and whether there are jobs available, and whether they get a pay rise, all those sorts of things. And so it's about not only giving people money, but giving people the right support, information, advice and guidance and encouragement to do it that would really help transfer that kind of emphasis from, actually, it's really hard to get people learning at the minute, but if we give them the right support, advice and some money to do it, I think we'd find it's much easier than we think. And our lockdown learning research says that where we take some of those barriers away and create a different context, there's more people than you think that would like to learn something new.
Thank you. Yeah, I've made some both made some very important points there about this. Not a silver bullet. It's got to be looked at as in the whole, as part of a overall overarching lifelong learning strategy, and the importance as well about having that ownership, having your own sort of personal account rather than these abstract entitlements, and particularly as well, Fiona, linking that to information, advice and guidance, letting people know what sort of opportunities are out there for them, and supporting them with that and helping them, give them the confidence to make that first step. So important. Final question I'm going to ask, and it would be amiss of me not to ask this, as we've got the budget next week. So what skills priorities would you like to see the Chancellor include in next week's budget announcement that would help to increase adult learning and retraining? Fiona, would you like to kick off on that one?
Oh, I've got a really long shopping list, I have to say. But I think for this audience, I just think it's ridiculous that the Union Learning Fund money has been taken away. We know that for many adults who aren't going to go near the publicly funded system, the place that they engage is through their workplace, and the credibility of not necessarily their employer, but someone in the workplace encouraging them to take part in learning. It comes through time and time again in the evidence, and I think the removal of the Union Learning Fund is just counterproductive for what we're trying to do. I want to see government have a lifelong learning strategy and a really long-term plan for engaging adults in learning, but I'm really disappointed in the short-term response that we've seen. So a level 3 entitlement is fine, but it doesn't start till next April. Skills is going to be a vital part of recovery, and I'd like to see some funding and some responsiveness of policy to help people whose jobs are on the line now. And there's lots more things, but you know, that'll do.
No, thanks. Yeah, that's a good start. That's a good. Ian.
Yeah, well, I'm not saying anything else with the Union Learning Fund. I think sort of it's great for colleagues and stakeholders like Lauren Watkins who've been making the case for us. But yeah, as I've seen in the chat, you know, I mean, devolved nations aren't getting rid of their Union Learning Fund. You know, Wales and Scotland are retaining them and even thinking of doing that. So it's very much a decision that covers England. I mean, I think there's two sets of priorities. I mean, the government's going to publish a further education and skills white paper probably sometime before the end of the year, and there's a need for much longer term reforms that I think even things like the development of lifelong learning accounts and stuff they could do there. I think I would probably reiterate what Fiona's just said. What are the immediate challenges? Well, the fact is that sort of people are losing their jobs and will continue to lose their jobs in the coming weeks and months, and sort of skills and training should be at the heart of the government's response to that. You know, other countries have job retention schemes where they have retraining as a kind of key element of their job retention schemes, I should say. So as well as subsidising wages, they're actually sort of giving people the opportunity to retrain. So I mean, we've been calling for that right to retrain, and sort of we've increased what we're saying around that in recent months. And you know, a level 3 entitlement from next April, if it does happen by next April, it's just not enough, really. We need to be sort of supporting people who are being thrown out of their jobs now and in the coming weeks, and sort of ramping up some kind of retraining offer to individuals. For example, I mean, the government seems to be playing about with actually deciding which level 3 qualifications should be eligible. I mean, why do you not just say to adults who are losing their jobs at the moment, you can go to college and do a level 3 qualification now? It's not rocket science. That could be done quite easily.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. I hope he was listening. All fantastic suggestions. I mean, you're both absolutely right. I mean, key is got to be retraining, reskilling to meet the challenges of the economic downturn, and we know there's going to be unfortunately more job losses coming down the line, and there does need to be a long-term plan, and it's something which we've been calling for some time, and completely agree about ULF, and the evidence and the research speaks for itself, so I don't think we really need to say any more than that, but thank you for all those contributions and comments. So that really sort of brings us to the sort of the end of today's webinar. We hope you found this session useful. We'll be adding the webinar to our YouTube channel, so you can watch it again or at your leisure, or share it with colleagues who weren't able to tune in and join us today. A big thank you to Fiona and Ian, and to Yusuf, who's been working behind the scenes. And a big thank you to you for taking the time out of your busy day to join us on this webinar. Thank you for taking part, and I hope you can join us again soon on Union Learn's next webinar. Thank you very much, and have a good day. Bye.